Good day. This discussion video is intended for subject you self or understanding the self. Okay, so knowing who you are as a person is an essential part of being an individual. When we were still kids, we loved to do role-playing games that portray who we want to be. Some of us fantasize about becoming an actress, a famous athlete, a doctor, a teacher, or some may even want to become a superhero. But as we grow up, we tend to discover more about ourselves. We're more serious in thinking about what do we really want in life. We think about our purpose, realistic goals, and we're able to discover the things that we're good at and at the same time the aspects that we need to improve on. It's interesting to consider how much time we spend contemplating what we want to do and the lifestyle we desire, and yet how little time we spend defining who we want to be. Because of the fast paced environment we have right now, people are too busy hustling and are too focused on comparing themselves to the success of others. And as a result, we forget to reflect and to pause from time to time and assess if we're still okay or are you still on the right path in life that you've been working on. It's important to have self awareness and have the guide to answer the question of who am I? As an introduction to this subject of understanding the self, I will be presenting to you the different perspectives of self from philosophers, psychologists, anthropologists, and other well known individuals who have contributed their theories of what their concept of self. So in this discussion video, it will be divided into five different studies that have their separate perspectives in explaining the self, namely philosophy, sociology, anthropology, psychology, and the self in Western and Oriental or Eastern thought. Okay, so let's start with Socrates. So Socrates is one of the individuals who shaped Western thought. He is known for his method of inquiry in testing an idea, or what we call the Socratic method. So what happens here in the Socratic method is that the individual would ask a series of questions to someone to delve into the person's view until the person's answer would expose contradictions to his answers before. So, what Socrates did during those times was that he questioned every day the views and Athenian beliefs, which led those leaders at that time being offended at of what Socrates did. So, because of the chain of events, Socrates was sentenced to death by drinking a cup of poison. Now, some of the popular ideas of Socrates are the following. So, the soul is immortal, and the care of the soul is the task of philosophy, and virtue is necessary to attain happiness. So, based on Socrates' concept, you can describe that he believed in the existence of two parts, which are the body and soul. So, these two are separate entities that even the soul is considered as a real substance that exists independently from the body. So, according to Socrates, your real self is not your body, but rather your soul, which is yourself, is the state of your inner being that determines the quality of your life. So with this, it has been categorized by Socrates the two kinds of existence, the visible, which is our physical body, and the invisible, our soul. So Socrates also added that the goal of life is to be happy. He defined happiness as being a person with virtues, and he characterizes virtues as having courage, temperance, prudence, and justice. Plato is known as the student of Socrates. So, with the influence of Socrates, he has a similar approach of self on which the important concept of the soul. With that being said, Plato mentioned that the soul is indeed the most divine aspect of the a human being. So what differs from his concept from Socrates is that Plato views the soul in an intellectual connotation. So Plato generated the three parts of the soul. First is the appetitive or the sensual. So this means that the soul has an element of having sensual experiences, or what we commonly termed as physiological needs. So we have basic needs of food, water, and sex. On the other hand, another part of the soul is the rational or the reasoning aspect. This is our consciousness and awareness. So this is the part of us that thinks, analyzes, and looks ahead rationally, weighs options, and tries to measure what is best and true for us. And lastly, the spirited or the feeling. So this is the part no that gets angry when it perceives, for example, an injustice being done. So this is the part of us that loves to face and overcome great challenges, and the part that can steel itself to adversity. And also the part of us that loves victory, winning challenges, and honor. Next is Saint Augustine. So Saint Augustine is deeply influenced by Plato's idea by adapting that the self is an immaterial soul. So what differs from Saint Augustine's from Plato's is that he incorporated the so-called theory of forms, which is more into Christian perspective. So this theory of forms are archetypes or models of creation in the divine mind. So the divine mind, no, or the divine ideas rather are the models for creatures in the eternal thought of God. So therefore, Augustine argues a moment of understanding some eternal truth is but a glimpse into a divine thought granted to humans by God in an act of illumination. So the following are aspects of the self or the soul according to Saint Augustine. So it can be aware of itself, it recognizes itself as a holistic one, and it is aware of its unity. Next, his famous of his line cogito ergo sum, which means I think therefore I am, and also considered as the father of modern Western philosophy. He is Rene Descartes. So Descartes claimed that this thinking entity, or what we called as the soul, could exist without a body because the soul is an immaterial substance. If you happen to read the book, Descartes considered the term self the same as the soul. So he explained that the immaterial substance of the self happens to form with the physical body. He clearly stated that even though the soul is being emerged with the body, still our soul is distinct from our bodies. According to Descartes, our soul is not prone to change and is not affected by time. Unlike our bodies, no, our physical bodies, it gets weaker. And you can tell the observable changes of one's body as time progresses, or as the person gets older, you'll see an observable changes of his or her physical body. Only the immaterial soul remains the same throughout time. So the immaterial soul is the source of our identity. Descartes did not focus on someone's physical appearance in determining his or her identity, but Descartes is more focused on the soul aspect, which cannot be seen by our naked eye. So John Locke's concept of human mind is a tabula rasa. So tabula rasa is defined or translated as blank state. So John Locke indicated that humans are being born blank, which means we are born with no mental content. John Locke pinpointed that in the definition of self to include the memories of that thinking thing. So he mentioned that the self consists of memory, that the person existing now is the same person yesterday because he or she remembers the thoughts, experiences, or actions of the earlier self. So Locke or John Locke goes on to suggest that one's personal identity extends only so far as one's consciousness. He offers the argument that because in order to be a self, one must be a thinking thing, and that because consciousness always accompanies thinking. The self with which one personally identifies extends and persists only so far as one's consciousness. So the consciousness Locke refers to can be equated with memory. So David Hume recognized two kinds of perception: impressions and ideas. So impressions are perceptions that the mind experiences with the most force and violence, and ideas are the faint images of impressions. So to fully understand the distinction between the two, impressions are felt and ideas are thoughts. So let's have an example. No, the impression, which is the experience of anger, has an unmistakable quality and intensity compared to the idea of anger, which is in a weaker form. So by thinking of anger, no more guarantees being angry than thinking of happiness guarantees being happy. So there seems to be a difference between the impression of anger and the idea of the anger of that Hume's theory. Immanuel Kant is the central figure in modern philosophy. So, one of the ideas that Kant proposed was that the human mind creates the structure of human experience. So, Kant's view of the self as transcendental. So, this means it is related to a spiritual or non physical realm. So, for Kant, the self is not in the body, but rather the self is outside the body and it does not have the qualities of the body. Kant proposed that knowledge bridges the self and the material things together. So he presented two components of the self, which are the inner and outer self. So inner self is the self uh, that are your psychological state, no, your moods, feelings, sensation, pleasure, and pain, while the outer self are your senses and the physical world. So it is the boundary between the external world and your inner self. So the outer self gathers information by using your senses on what experiences in your environment, like what you see, what you hear, no, what you feel, and with this, the inner self will interpret it for you. Okay, so a philosopher, physiologist, and psychologist, Sigmund Freud was one of the major proponents in contributing the knowledge about the human psyche. So, psyche is defined as the totality of the human mind, both conscious and unconscious. And this was how Freud identified the self. So, Freud divided personality into three levels: the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. So the conscious, as Freud defined the term, corresponds to its ordinary everyday meaning. It includes all the sensations and experiences of which we are aware at any given moment. So, for example, if you're studying for an exam, as you read your notes, the conscious feeling that you feel, like the conscious feeling that you see and you read the words on your notes are considered the conscious level of personality. So Freud considered the conscious a limited aspect of personality because only a small portion of our thoughts, sensations, and memories exist in conscious awareness at any time. So he compared the mind to an iceberg. So as what being presented on the slide, the conscious is the portion above the surface of the water. So merely the tip of the iceberg. You can also see this picture on your books, no? So the next level is the preconscious. So it is the storehouse of memories, perceptions, and thoughts of which we are not consciously aware at the moment, but that we can easily summon into consciousness. So for example, you are currently reading a book, then suddenly you begin to think your friends, no, about like what you did yesterday. So preconscious is somewhat bringing up a memory from your preconscious into your consciousness. So we often find our attention shifting back and forth from experiences of the moment to events and memories in the preconscious. And lastly, the unconscious. This is the largest and invisible portion below the surface. So the unconscious part is wherein the focus of Freud's theory. So it is vast. It has dark depths, and it is the home of the instincts, our wishes and our desires that can cause to do such thing as to do such thing, no, like our behavior. So the unconscious contains the major driving power behind all behaviors and is the place of forces we cannot see or we cannot control it. So Sigmund Freud also introduced three basic structures of personality. So the id, ego, and superego. So the id operates on the pleasure principle. So every wishful impulse should be satisfied immediately regardless of the consequences. And the next is the ego. So the ego operates accordingly to the reality principle. So it works out realistic ways of satisfying the id's demands. So the ego often postpones the satisfaction to avoid negative consequences of society. And lastly, the superego is the one who incorporates the values and morals of society. So the superego, its function is to control the id's impulses, and it persuades the ego to choose moralistic goals and to strive for perfection rather than simply realistic ones. So the superego is a powerful and largely unconscious set of dictates or beliefs that we acquire from childhood, no, that we have already these ideas that what is right or what is wrong and what are the acceptable and not acceptable behaviors in our society. So superego consists of two systems. So first is the conscience. It is similar to guilt or feeling bad towards someone or a thing, and conscience is present when the ego gives in to its demands. Second is the ideal self. So this is an imaginary picture of how you must be as a person. So for Paul Churchland, his philosophy stands on materialistic view or the belief that nothing but matter exists. So therefore, anything that can be seen, felt, heard, touched, or tasted means it does exist. So Churchland disregards the idea of the soul's existence since it cannot be experienced by our senses. For Maurice Merleau-Ponty, he rejected the mind-body dualism, but instead proposed that the mind and the body are intrinsically connected. So unlike two philosophers that clearly stated the separation of the soul and physical body, for Merleau-Ponty, he did not agree with this notion. He argues that the body is part of the mind and the mind is part of the body. That although there could be a standalone mental faculty that perceives what the senses experience, so it needs the body to receive these experiences, act on its perceptions, and communicate with the external world. So the body acts what the mind perceives as a unified one. Now let's tackle sociology. So we're done with the philosophy aspect. So sociology is a study of the development, structure, and functioning of human society. Sociology is focused on seeking answers to how society affects the individual and vice versa. So, how does society affect the self? So, sociology postulated that the norms, which are the acceptable and standards of the society, the beliefs and values, help shape our self-identity. So, it also includes the significance of modernization on how it affected the individuals build and develop their self-identity. So by inspecting the different eras in society, you can observe the changes no, on how people behave and interact with other individuals. So the difference between those people from the millennials, the Gen Z, no, so you can see some observable behaviors, no, and a change of beliefs from the society. So there's also an evolvement, no, of people's lifestyle and modification of society's beliefs. Sociologist George Simmel expressed that people create social networks by joining social groups. So what are social groups? So it is defined as having two or more people interacting with one another, sharing similar characteristics, and whose members identify themselves as part of the group. Social groups are being categorized into two groups, so organic group and rational group. The organic group is naturally occurring and it is highly influenced by your family. So in an organic group, you are somehow automatically being part of that specific group, and a huge part of the reason for that is the influence of your family. So for example, uh, let's take an example for a religious group no that you're part of. So of course there's a possibility that you'll change your faith no once you'll get older, but let's take an example when we were still kids no, the majority of us are included in the same religious group as to our respective families. So you join these groups because your family is also part of it, and the driving force of being affiliated with these groups is called organic motivation. On the other hand, the rational group is formed as a matter of shared self-interest. So moreover, people join these groups out of their own free will. So this willingness is what we call the rational motivation. So a social network refers to the ties of or connections that link you to your social group. So for example, that connection that you have with your family is your blood relation with them, or for others, like you have a connection with your friends because you share common interest, or you share you have similar hobbies with them. That's why you're connected with these certain types of people. So George Herbert Mead's work focused on how the self is developed. So his theory is based on the perspective that the self is a product of social interactions and internalizing other people's views along with one's personal view about oneself. So he developed the different stages of development, which are language, play, and game. So first, the language stage. So this is when a person is able to identify symbols, gestures, and sound, and at the same time being able to understand the meaning of those things. No, the second is the play stage. So this is wherein the person is being able to understand other people's perspectives. So you are able to understand the people's actions and why they did those kinds of behavior. And lastly, the game stage. So, since you were able to understand other people's perspectives, you can now able to incorporate the societal rules into it. So you can now assess if those behaviors were right or wrong, and you can have a full grasp of what's happening around you. Mead also included the two sides of self, which are the I and me. So me is the product of what the person has learned while interacting with others and with the environment. So these are the person's learned behaviors, attitudes, and expectations set by society. I, on the other hand, is the part of the self that is unsocialized and spontaneous. So the I does not blindly follow rules and enables the person to express individualism. So anthropology focuses on understanding the human condition in its cultural aspect. So this specific slide will discuss how culture can affect one's self. So cultural anthropologists have like arguments that the self is culturally shaped. So cultural traditions and social practices regulate, express, and transforms the human mind. Developmental psychologist Catherine Reeve believed that culture can influence how you view relationships, personality traits, achievement, and expressing emotions. So in relationships, you can distinguish some differences when comparing between Western and Eastern cultures. So for example, when it comes to relationships in companies or businesses, in the Western culture, people tend to prefer formal meetings in which to engage into business activities. While in the Eastern culture, instead of keeping relationships strictly professional, there's a personal sharing and the development of closer long-term bonds, no, and it's highly encouraged. So there's a desire to form relationships with colleagues, something which requires time and trust to create, and individuals can often feel offended or shamed if others do not reciprocate. That is common in the Eastern culture. So for personality traits, we differ on how we perceive some values or characteristics of person. So some cultures may find it rude, but to your culture it's okay. So for example, here in the Philippines, we value respect, no, especially to those people who are older than us. We even do have words that must be used when talking to elders, like such as po and opo, or calling someone kuya or ate. So some cultures don't pay attention to these details at all. And then achievement. So we have different standards of success depending on our culture. And lastly, expressing emotions. So some cultures prohibit women from expressing their emotions, or some other cultures do not encourage men to show a vulnerable side of them. So it still depends, no, on what culture you belong to. And with this, it can affect your self identity. So let's move on to psychology. So psychology is the scientific study of how people behave, think, and feel. So by the way, with my previous slide, you can include also Sigmund Freud in the perspective of psychology. Okay, so let's discuss John Piaget, who pioneered the theory of cognitive development. So there are three basic components to Piaget's cognitive theory. First, schemas or schemes. So this is a category of knowledge as well as the process of acquiring that knowledge. And then second, adaptation. No, he believed that people are constantly adapting to the environment as they take in new information and learn new things. And third, the stages of cognitive development. So in the stages of cognitive development, no, Piaget theorizes, no, that children progress through four stages and that they all do so in the same order. So the sensory motor stage is by the age of 0 to 2 years old. So the child learns by doing, looking, touching, sucking, and have primitive understanding of cause and effect relationships. The pre-operational stage is by the age of 2 to 7 years. So the child uses language, symbols, letters, and numbers. And then concrete operations are by the age of 7 to 11. So the child demonstrates conservation, reversibility, serial ordering, and a mature understanding of the cause and effect relationships. And lastly, the formal operation is by the age of 12 years and above. So the individual demonstrates abstract thinking at this stage. So I expect, no, by John Piaget's theory, is expected by your age group, to this particular age group, to have formal operations. Okay, so as psychologist, author, and professor, Dr. Susan Harter proposed the development of self-concept. So during early childhood, when asked to describe his or herself, their answers are concrete, observable characteristics such as physical attributes, material possessions, behaviors, and preferences. So for example, no, the child will answer statements like I am pretty, I have lots of toys, I love candies. So the child's interpretation of their selves is somewhat superficial, no, by that age group. By middle to later adulthood, the self is described in terms of a trait like constructs. No, if you will ask a child with this specific age group from middle to later childhood, they will answer you, or they will define themselves as being smart, honest, friendly, or shy, depending to the child. No? So during the adolescence phase, this is the emergence of more abstract self-definitions, such as inner thoughts, emotions, attitudes, and motives. Then, in emerging adults, it marked the characteristic of self for having a vision of possible self. So during the ages 17 to 22, this is the time of grand dreams, wherein the vision of being wealthy and glamorous occupation must be achieved. But around ages to 28 to 33, the visions of a possible self became more realistic, but of course still with optimism. So realistic in the sense that you're able to you are able to assess your current situation if your grand dreams, no, are still plausible to achieve in the future. Okay, so a figure commonly known as the father of American psychology, William James, proposed that the self has two elements, the I self and the me self. So the I is the part of the self that knows who they are and what they have accomplished in life. It is the self that is aware of your actions. The me is a separate individual, a person refers to when talking about their personal experiences. So it is the self that you can describe, such as your physical characteristics, personalities, social role, or relationships. Okay. Next, Carl Rogers. So Carl Rogers divided the self into two categories. So the ideal self and the real self. The ideal self is the person that you would like yourself to be. It is your concept of the best me. So it is the idealized image of self that the individual has developed based on what you have learned and experienced. The ideal self could include your desires that is influenced by your parents. So for example, your possible careers that your parents aspire to for you to pursue. So ideal self can also be thoughts that you admire in others, such as things or achievements that other people have already accomplished, that you wish that you'll also obtain those things. The ideal self is also what society sees as acceptable, the behaviors that we need to follow, since that is the norm, and also that's what you think is in your best interest. On the other hand, the real self is the person you are, or it is how you behave right at the moment of a situation. So it is who you are in reality. It is how you think, you feel, or act at the present moment. So Carl Rogers clearly emphasized that there must be a consistency between the ideal self and real self, because if there's a high congruence between those two, it will lead to a greater sense of self-worth and a healthy, productive life to the person. Gordon Allport proposed his personality trait theory, no, asserting that every person possesses traits. A trait is your essential characteristic that never ever changes and sticks with you all your life. Moreover, no, these traits shape who you are, how you think, feel, or behave in any given day. Psychiatrist Eric Byrne pronounced that every person has three parts called ego states in his or her personality: the parent, adult, and child. So the parent ego state is the voice that tells what you should and should not do. The adult ego state is the rational person. It speaks reasonably and knows how to assert itself. There are three child ego states: the natural child, is the part of us who loves to play but sensitive and vulnerable. The little professor is our curious side, wherein we want to try everything. While the adaptive child is the one who reacts to the world. It's either we try to fit in or rebel against the authority. Lastly, Winnicott introduced the concept of the self and true self. So the false self is a mask or persona. So it is a form of defense that constantly seeks to anticipate others' demands and complying with them. So as a way of protecting the true self from a world that is felt to be unsafe. So when the person has a false self but can still function as the true self, and at the same time being able to know when to present one's false self to the society, then that person has a healthy false self. On the other hand, an unhealthy false self is an individual who may seem happy and comfortable in his or her environment but actually feels forced to fit in and constantly needs to adjust his behavior to adapt to the social situation, is said to have an unhealthy false self. So the true self is a sense of being alive and real in one's mind and body, having feelings that are spontaneous and unforced. This experience of aliveness is what allows people to be genuinely close to others and to be creative. Apart from geographical locations, no, these two parts of the world, the East and the West, have differences in their way of life and their approach to life in general. So these ways of living are not only brought about by topography and physical circumstances that play crucial factors in living, but also the school of thought that governs the major societies, no, in the eastern and western parts of the world. So the main difference between the school of thoughts or the perspectives, no, of these philosophies of the East and West are the West, the Western part, no, or the West individualism and the East collectivism, as what uh, we are commonly known. So the Eastern philosophy is drawn much more into groups or society or people's actions and thoughts as one to find meaning in life, as they try to get rid of the false me concept and find meaning in discovering the true me concerning everything around them or as part of a bigger scheme. In contrast to the Eastern thought, the Western civilization is more individualistic, trying to find the meaning of life here and now with life at the center as it is already given and part of the divine. So kindly check my post on our Google Classroom since I provided the link there for the concise presentation, since there's really a lot of differences, no, about between the Eastern and Western thought. So you can just click the link and study the different Western and Oriental or Eastern thoughts there. If you already have the book, you can check it at pages 47 and pages 47 to 48. Okay, so that ends my presentation for this specific chapter. If you have questions or clarifications about the topics presented, you may chat with me on my UB Facebook account. So thank you for your attention.